The stagecoach burned under the merciless desert sun, black smoke twisting into the sky like a curse. Bodies lay scattered across the blood-soaked sand. The schoolteacher was gone, dragged into the wilderness by men who wore death like a second skin. The marshal was dead. The gold was stolen. And somewhere in the vast, unforgiving frontier, a ruthless gang was laughing while an innocent woman fought to survive. But they made one mistake. They left a trail. And Sheriff Ethan Calder was coming. Before we ride into this storm of vengeance and survival, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story can travel across the frontier of the internet. Now, let's begin. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of sand and stone broken only by scattered sagebrush and the skeletal remains of long-dead Joshua trees. Heat shimmered off the ground in visible waves, distorting the horizon into a liquid mirage. The road, if it could even be called that, was nothing more than packed earth and wagon ruts cutting through the wasteland like a scar. The stagecoach rattled along that scar, its wheels kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air behind it. 6 horses pulled the weathered vehicle, their flanks dark with sweat, their breathing labored in the oppressive heat. The driver, a grizzled man named Pike, with a face like cracked leather, squinted against the glare and kept the reins steady in his calloused hands. "How much further to Redemption Springs?" The voice came from inside the coach, feminine and strained. Pike spat a stream of tobacco juice over the side. 3, maybe 4 hours, miss. Depends on whether these horses hold out." Inside the coach, Clara Whitfield pressed a handkerchief to her forehead, dabbing at the perspiration that refused to stop flowing. She was 24 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent brown eyes that took in everything around her. Her dress, once a respectable shade of blue, was now dusty and wrinkled from 2 days of travel. Across from her sat 2 men who couldn't have been more different. Marshal Tom Bridger was a thick-shouldered man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and a mustache that drooped past his jaw. His star caught the light that filtered through the coach windows. His hand never strayed far from the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. The Reason sat beside him, wrists bound in iron shackles. The prisoner was a lean, dangerous-looking man named Jack Morelli. His eyes were the color of dirty ice, and when he smiled, which he did often, there was nothing warm in it. He'd been arrested for murder in Silver Creek and was being transported to stand trial in Redemption Springs. "Awful hot for a lady to be traveling alone," Morley said, his voice smooth as snake oil. "What takes a refined woman like yourself out into this God-forsaken country?" Clara didn't look at him. "I'm a schoolteacher. The children in Redemption Springs need education." "Education?" Morley laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin can. "Out here, the only education that matters is how fast you can draw a gun and how well you can shoot it." "That's enough," Bridger growled. "Keep your mouth shut, Morley." The prisoner's smile widened. "Just making conversation, Marshal. Just making conversation." Clara turned her gaze to the window, watching the endless desert roll past. She'd left everything behind in Philadelphia, a comfortable home, a predictable life, a man who wanted to marry her and give her a safe, boring existence. She'd wanted more. She'd wanted to make a difference, to bring learning and civilization to the wild frontier. Now, bouncing along in a dusty stagecoach with a convicted killer and a weary marshal, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The shotgun rider sitting next to Pike was a young man named Danny Reeves, barely 20 years old. He cradled a double-barreled shotgun across his lap and kept scanning the landscape with nervous eyes. "You see something?" Pike asked without looking at him. "Thought I saw movement, up in those rocks to the north." Pike glanced that direction but saw nothing except more desert. "Probably just a coyote. Or your imagination. Relax, boy." But Danny couldn't relax. There was something about this stretch of road that made his skin crawl. Too quiet, too empty, too perfect for an ambush. Inside the coach, Marshal Bridger checked his pocket watch. "We should reach the way station in about an hour. We'll water the horses and rest before pushing on." Clara nodded, grateful for the prospect of stretching her legs. Morley was staring at her again. "You scared, schoolteacher?" "Of what?" "Of dying out here. Of never making it to your precious school. Of ending up as just another pile of bones bleaching in the sun." Bridger's hand moved to his gun. "I said that's enough." I'm just saying, Morley continued, his smile never wavering. The frontier doesn't care about your dreams or your plans. It takes what it wants, when it wants, and it's always hungry. Clara met his gaze directly for the first time. The frontier is just land, Mr. Morelli. It's men who choose to be monsters. Something flickered in the prisoner's eyes. Surprise, maybe? Or respect? Then the smile was back. Well said, schoolteacher. Well said. The miles rolled on. The sun climbed higher. The heat became almost unbearable. And then Pike saw them. They were half a mile ahead, visible only because of the dust they kicked up. Riders. At least 6 of them, maybe more. They'd emerged from a canyon mouth and were now positioned directly across the road. Pike's blood turned cold. "Marshal!" he shouted. "We got company!" Inside the coach, Bridger was instantly alert. He looked out the window and cursed. "How many?" "Can't tell for sure. At least 6. Danny raised the shotgun, his hands shaking. "What do we do?" Pike considered their options. They could try to turn around, but the horses were already tired. They'd never outrun fresh mounts. They could try to negotiate, but men who set ambushes weren't usually interested in conversation. "We keep going," Pike decided. "Maybe they'll let us pass. And maybe the desert will turn to ice," Bridger muttered. He leaned forward. "Miss Whitfield, get down on the floor. Now." Clara's face had gone pale, but she moved quickly, crouching in the space between the seats. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Morley watched the approaching riders with interest. Well, well, this just got interesting." The coach continued forward, closing the distance. The riders didn't move. They sat their horses like statues, waiting. As they drew closer, details became clear. The men were hard-faced and heavily armed. Bandanas covered the lower halves of their faces. Their hands rested on guns. The man in the center sat slightly ahead of the others. Even from a distance, there was something about him that screamed danger. He was tall in the saddle, dressed in black from hat to boots, with a long duster that hung past his stirrups. This was Doyle Riker, though Pike didn't know it yet. Riker raised one hand, a signal. Pike pulled back on the reins, bringing the stagecoach to a halt about 50 yards from the line of riders. Dust settled around them. The only sound was the labored breathing of the horses and the creak of leather. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Riker kneed his horse forward, walking it slowly toward the stagecoach. The other riders followed, spreading out to form a semicircle. Pike's mouth was dry as sand. "What do you want?" Riker stopped his horse 20 feet away. His eyes, pale blue and utterly cold, surveyed the stagecoach with casual interest. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly soft. "That's a fair question. What do I want?" He tilted his head as if considering. "I want the strongbox you're carrying, the one with the mining company payroll. I want any valuables the passengers might have, and I want you to hand them over without making this difficult." Inside the coach, Bridger had drawn his revolver. He spoke quietly to Clara. "Stay down. No matter what happens, stay down." Pike knew they were in trouble. These weren't opportunistic thieves. They knew about the payroll. Someone had talked. "There's no payroll on this coach," Pike lied. "Just passengers." Riker's expression didn't change. "Well, now that's disappointing, because my information says otherwise." He glanced at one of his men. "Cole, why don't you go check the back boot? See what our friend Pike here is trying to hide." A lean man with a scarred face dismounted and walked toward the rear of the coach. "Don't you touch that coach!" Danny shouted, raising the shotgun. It was a mistake. Riker's hand moved with cobra speed, drawing and firing in one smooth motion. The shot caught Danny in the chest, punching him backward off the driver's seat. He hit the ground hard and lay still, the shotgun falling from his lifeless fingers. Pike froze in horror. Inside the coach, Bridger kicked open the door and stepped out, his revolver raised. "U.S. Marshal, drop your weapons!" Riker looked at him with something like amusement. "A marshal. How official." He raised his voice. "Boys, we got law here. Anybody worried about that?" Laughter rippled through the gang. Bridger kept his gun steady. "This coach is under federal protection. You're all under arrest for murder and—" "Federal protection." Riker interrupted him, shaking his head. "Marshal, look around. You see any federal government out here? Any army? Any help coming?" He leaned forward in his saddle. "There's just you, an old driver, and whatever's in that coach. And there's 8 of us. So let's talk about who's protecting who. Cole had reached the back of the coach and was working on the lock to the boot. Got it, boss. He pulled out the strongbox, a heavy iron container secured with a thick padlock. Must be 50 pounds of gold in here at least. Riker smiled. See, Marshal? My information was good. Now here's how this is going to work. You're going to put down that gun. Your driver's going to climb down, and whoever's inside that coach is going to step out nice and slow. If everybody cooperates, maybe you'll live to tell stories about the day you met Doyle Riker. Bridger didn't lower his weapon. I know who you are, Riker. I know about the banks you've robbed, the men you've killed. You let these people go, and You'll what? Riker's voice went cold. You're in no position to negotiate, Marshal, but I'll tell you what. I'm feeling generous today, so I'll give you to the count of 3 to put down that gun. Don't do it, Morley called from inside the coach. He's going to kill us anyway. Riker glanced at the coach window. Now who's that? Another lawman? Prisoner, Bridger said. None of your concern. 1, Riker counted. Bridger's jaw tightened. He knew Morley was probably right. Men like Riker didn't leave witnesses. 2. Pike started to climb down from the driver's seat, his hands raised. Just take the gold and go. No need for more killing. Clara remained crouched on the floor of the coach, her hands pressed over her mouth to keep from crying out. She could hear everything, the casual menace in Riker's voice, the fear in Pike's, the deadly silence that stretched between counts. 3. Bridger made his choice. He fired. The shot was true, catching one of Riker's men in the shoulder and spinning him out of the saddle. But before Bridger could fire again, half a dozen guns roared in response. The Marshal's body jerked as bullets tore through him. He staggered, tried to raise his weapon one more time, then collapsed in the dust. Blood pooled beneath him, turning the sand dark. No! Clara screamed. The sound drew Riker's attention. Well now, what have we here? Pike jumped down from the driver's seat and ran to Bridger's side, but it was too late. The Marshal's eyes were already glassy, staring at nothing. Riker dismounted and walked to the coach. He pulled open the door and looked inside. Clara pressed herself into the corner, terror written across her face. Morley sat calmly, his shackled hands resting in his lap. A woman, Riker observed, and a prisoner. This day just keeps getting more interesting. His eyes fixed on Clara. Come on out, darling, nice and slow. Clara didn't move. She couldn't. Fear had frozen her limbs. I said out! Riker's voice hardened. One of his men, a heavy-set brute with a broken nose, reached in and grabbed Clara's arm, dragging her roughly from the coach. She cried out in pain as she stumbled into the sunlight. Please, she whispered. Please don't hurt me. Riker studied her with those cold blue eyes. You got a name? Clara Whitfield. Well, Miss Whitfield, I'm afraid you chose the wrong day to travel. He turned to his men. Get the gold loaded, kill the driver, and bring her. Wait! Clara pulled against the man holding her. Why? I'm nobody. I have nothing. Riker paused. That's where you're wrong. You're a witness, and witnesses are either useful or they're dead. He smiled, and it was the most frightening thing Clara had ever seen. We'll figure out which one you are later. Pike tried to run. He made it 5 steps before a bullet took him in the back. He fell forward and lay still. Clara screamed again, a raw sound of horror and despair. Morley watched from the coach, his expression unreadable. What about me? Riker glanced at him. What about you? These shackles are mighty uncomfortable, and I'm guessing you could use a man who knows the territory. You think I need your help? I think, Morley said carefully, that I know where the Marshal was taking me, and I know which roads have cavalry patrols and which ones don't. I know where the water is and where the quicksand hides, and I know how to make a crime scene tell whatever story you want it to tell. Riker considered this. You got a name, prisoner? Jack Morley, and I'm very good at staying alive. That a fact? Riker drew his gun and pointed it at Morley's head. Prove it. Tell me something useful in the next 5 seconds, or I paint the inside of that coach with your brains. Morley didn't flinch. The key to these shackles is in the Marshal's pocket, and if you stage this right, make it look like Apaches did it, You'll have every soldier in the territory looking in the wrong direction while you disappear." A slow smile spread across Riker's face. "Now that's interesting." He lowered the gun. "Cole, get his key." Cole knelt beside Bridger's body and rifled through the pockets, pulling out a small iron key. He tossed it to Riker, who caught it one-handed. Riker unlocked Morley's shackles and they fell away with a clank. The prisoner rubbed his wrists, then stepped out of the coach. "Welcome to the gang," Riker said. "Try to betray me and you'll die slower than you can imagine." Morley nodded. "Understood." The gang worked quickly. They transferred the strongbox to one of their horses. They gathered what few valuables the passengers had carried. And then, under Morelli's direction, they began to stage the scene. Clara was forced to watch as they mutilated the bodies, cutting them in ways that might suggest Apache weapons. They took arrows from a saddlebag, stolen from another ambush, Clara realized with horror, and stuck them in the corpses. They scalped Pike and Danny, their blood-slick hands working with practiced efficiency. She turned away and vomited into the sand. "Creative, isn't it?" Morley said, standing beside her. "When they find this, they'll think the Apache did it, broke the treaty, went back to war. The army will hunt every Indian in 100 miles while we ride free and clear." "You're a monster," Clara whispered. "I'm a survivor, Miss Whitfield. Same as you, if you're smart." Riker walked over, wiping blood from his hands with a cloth. "We're done here. Mount up." Clara was thrown onto a horse in front of Cole, who wrapped one arm around her waist in an iron grip. She tried to pull away, but he just laughed. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Somewhere quiet," Riker replied. "Somewhere we can decide what to do with you." The gang rode out, heading north toward the canyon they'd emerged from earlier. Behind them, the stagecoach sat silent and still, surrounded by bodies and blood and the lies they'd arranged. The sun continued its merciless arc across the sky. Vultures were already circling. As the gang rode deeper into the desert, Clara tried to memorize everything. The direction they traveled, the landmarks they passed, anything that might help someone find her, if anyone even looked. But with each mile, hope faded a little more. The terrain grew rougher. They entered a maze of canyons and arroyos, winding through passages barely wide enough for the horses. The walls rose high on either side, blocking out much of the sunlight and creating pockets of shadow that felt almost cool. Riker led the way with absolute confidence. He'd clearly traveled this route before. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a hidden valley, a small oasis in the desert with actual trees and a spring-fed pool. There were remnants of old structures here, adobe walls crumbling back into the earth. "This is where we split up," Riker announced. "Cole, Mercer, you take the gold to the hideout in the Broken Hills. Rest of you scatter. Meet up at Salt Creek in 3 days." The men nodded, already dividing the loot and preparing to leave. "What about her?" Cole asked, nodding at Clara. Riker looked at her as if considering his options. Clara held her breath. "Bring her along," he decided. "Might be useful. Might be leverage. Might be entertainment. We'll see." Clara's blood ran cold. Morley spoke up. "If you're going to keep her, you need to keep her alive and unharmed. A living hostage has value. A corpse is just evidence." Riker studied Morley with those flat, emotionless eyes. "You making demands already? Just pointing out the obvious, you're smart enough to know I'm right." For a moment, tension crackled between them. Then Riker nodded slowly. "Fair point. Nobody touches her without my say-so." He raised his voice. "You hear that, boys? The woman's off limits until I decide otherwise." Some of the men grumbled, but none argued. They rested for an hour, watering the horses and refilling canteens. Clara sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree, her hands shaking, her mind racing. She kept thinking about Marshall Bridger, how he'd tried to protect her, how he'd died in the sand, about Pike and Danny, about the lie that would be believed, the war that might be started because of what these men had done. Morley sat down nearby. "You're in shock. That's natural. Don't talk to me." "Listen, schoolteacher, I know you think I'm worse than them, but I'm not. I'm just practical. And right now, being practical is what's keeping you alive." Clara turned to look at him. "You helped them. You showed them how to make it look like an Indian attack." "I did. And by doing that, I made myself valuable to Riker, which means I'm more likely to survive. And by convincing him to keep you alive, I gave you a chance you wouldn't have otherwise had." He leaned closer. "I'm not your friend, Miss Whitfield, but I'm not your worst enemy either. Remember that." Before Clara could respond, Riker called out, "Time to move." They rode out again, this time heading west. Cole and Mercer split off with the strongbox, taking 2 other men with them. That left Riker, Morley, and 3 others, a scarred man named Vance, a Mexican gunfighter called Chavez, and a silent, dangerous-looking half-breed everyone called Wolf. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The temperature dropped rapidly as darkness approached. They rode for another 2 hours before making camp in a box canyon. "No fire. Too risky," Riker said. They ate dried meat and hardtack in the darkness, speaking in low voices. Clara was tied to a tree at the edge of the camp, her hands bound but not painfully tight. Wolf brought her water and food, his face expressionless. She forced herself to eat, knowing she'd need her strength. The men settled in for the night. Vance took first watch, walking the perimeter with a rifle. Clara closed her eyes but knew sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept replaying the ambush, the violence, the casual way these men had killed. She thought about the school in Redemption Springs that would be waiting for a teacher who would never arrive, about her family in Philadelphia who would eventually receive news of her death. No, she couldn't think like that. She had to believe she'd survive, had to believe someone would come. But who? The nearest town was days away. The stagecoach wouldn't be found for hours, maybe days, and when it was found, everyone would think Apaches were responsible. Riker had planned this perfectly. "You should try to sleep." Clara's eyes snapped open. Morley had moved closer, sitting with his back against a rock. "How can you be so calm?" she whispered. "Practice. I've been in bad situations before. The trick is not to panic. Panic makes you stupid, and stupid gets you killed." "What are they going to do with me?" Morley was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I don't know. Riker's unpredictable. But as long as you're useful, or as long as he thinks you might be, you'll live. And when I stop being useful?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The night stretched on, cold and silent, except for the occasional call of a coyote or the skitter of something small moving through the rocks. Clara dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound. When dawn finally came, she was exhausted and terrified, but still alive. The gang rose with the sun. They broke camp quickly, moving with the efficiency of men who'd done this many times before. As they prepared to ride out, Riker walked over to Clara. "You're going to ride with Chavez today. You cause any trouble, he'll gut you and leave you for the buzzards. Understood?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. They rode hard all morning, pushing deeper into the wilderness. The landscape became more desolate, endless stretches of rock and sand broken by the occasional scrub brush. In the distance, mountains rose like broken teeth. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses. Clara's legs were cramped from riding, her skin sunburned despite the bonnet she wore. Riker studied the horizon with a spyglass, looking for pursuit. "Nothing. They probably haven't even found the coach yet." Vance laughed. "Even if they have, they're looking for Apaches, not us." "Don't get cocky," Riker warned. "Cocky gets you caught." They rode on. The sun climbed higher, turning the world into a furnace. Clara's throat was raw with thirst, but she didn't ask for water. She'd learned that complaining only drew attention. By late afternoon, they reached their destination, a ramshackle settlement that could barely be called a town. A dozen buildings, most of them abandoned, scattered around a dry creek bed. The only sign of life was a cantina with a torn awning and a corral with a few tired-looking horses. "Salt Creek," Riker announced, "or what's left of it." They rode into the settlement, dismounting in front of the cantina. An old Mexican man emerged, squinting at them in the harsh light. "Senor Riker, you return." "I do, Diego. We need rooms, food, and discretion. Can you provide all 3? The old man's eyes flicked to Clara, taking in her torn dress and frightened expression. "Si, as always." Clara was dragged inside. The cantina was dark and smelled of stale beer and old tobacco. A few rough-looking men sat at tables, eyeing the newcomers with interest. Riker pointed to a door at the back. "Put her in the storage room. Lock it." Wolf grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her toward the door. She tried to resist, but he was too strong. He shoved her into a small, windowless room filled with crates and barrels, then slammed the door. She heard a bolt slide home. Darkness closed around her like a fist. Clara sank to the floor, finally allowing herself to cry. Great, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for the men who died, for her own shattered dreams, for the terror that consumed her. But beneath the fear, something else was growing, something harder. Anger. These men had taken everything from her. They'd killed innocent people. They'd staged a massacre that could start a war, and they thought they'd get away with it. Clara wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. She was alive. As long as she was alive, there was hope. Somewhere out there, someone would figure out the truth. Someone would come. She just had to survive until they did. 70 miles to the south, in the town of Copper Ridge, Sheriff Ethan Calder was finishing his evening rounds when a rider thundered into town, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. "Sheriff! Sheriff Calder!" Ethan turned, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. The rider practically fell from his saddle, staggering toward him. "The stagecoach! The Redemption Springs run! It's been attacked!" Ethan caught the man by his shoulders. "Slow down. What happened?" "Found it on the north road. Everyone's dead. Looked like Indians did it. Arrows and scalping and..." The man doubled over, retching. Ethan's jaw tightened. "How long ago?" "Can't be more than a day. The bodies weren't too far gone." "Indians, you're sure?" "Had to be. Who else would..." But Ethan was already moving, his mind racing. Something didn't sit right. The Apache had been quiet for months. Why would they break the peace now? He gathered a posse in less than an hour, 6 good men who could ride and shoot. They left Copper Ridge as the sun set, carrying torches and grim determination. By midnight, they'd reached the ambush site. Ethan dismounted and walked slowly through the scene, his torch casting dancing shadows. The bodies lay where they'd fallen, mutilated and grotesque. Arrows protruded from flesh, blood had soaked into the sand. But Ethan had seen Apache attacks before. Something was wrong here. He knelt beside the marshal's body, studying the wounds. These arrows, they're in too neat, like they were pushed in after death, not shot from distance. One of his men, a tracker named Hoskins, was examining the ground. "Sheriff, these tracks don't match up. Shod horses, not unshod ponies. And look here, they came from the North Canyon, not from tribal lands." Ethan stood, his eyes scanning the scene with new understanding. This wasn't Indians. This was staged to look like Indians. But why? The strongbox is gone. This was a robbery. They made it look like an Indian attack to throw off pursuit. Another man called out, "Sheriff, found something!" Ethan walked over. The man held up a piece of torn fabric, blue dress material, caught on a piece of sagebrush. "There was a passenger list," one of the posse members said. "A schoolteacher was traveling to Redemption Springs, Clara Whitfield." Ethan took the fabric, examining it carefully. "Where's her body?" They searched the scene thoroughly. Driver, shotgun rider, marshal, prisoner, all accounted for, but no woman. "They took her," Ethan said quietly. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Hoskins shook his head. "If they took her, Sheriff, she's probably already dead. Men who do this kind of thing don't leave witnesses." "Maybe. Or maybe they've got other plans for her." Ethan's voice was hard as iron. "Either way, we're going after them. Sheriff, the trail's already cold. By now they could be anywhere. And if we go chasing off after outlaws when folks think it's an Indian attack, then we make sure people know the truth," Ethan interrupted. "This massacre was designed to start a war. I'm not letting that happen. We track these bastards down, we bring them to justice, and we bring Miss Whitfield home, dead or alive." He looked at each man in turn. "Anyone who's not willing to ride for that can head back now. No judgment." None of the men moved. Ethan nodded. "Good. We ride at first light. Hoskins, you're our tracker. Find their trail and don't lose it. The rest of you pack light and pack for a long hunt. These men have a head start, but they made a mistake." "What mistake?" someone asked. Ethan's eyes were cold in the torchlight. "They let us know they exist, and now I'm going to make them regret it." As the posse made camp for what remained of the night, Ethan stood alone, staring into the darkness where the killers had fled. He thought about the woman, Clara Whitfield, the schoolteacher. He didn't know her, had never met her, but she was under his protection the moment she'd entered his territory. And he'd failed her. That failure burned in his gut like acid, but it also gave him purpose. Somewhere out there, men who thought themselves untouchable were celebrating their success. They thought they'd committed the perfect crime. They were wrong. Ethan Calder was coming, and he would not stop until every last one of them answered for what they'd done. The hunt had begun. The desert dawn came cold and merciless, painting the blood-stained sand in shades of pink and gold that mocked the horror of what had happened there. Ethan Calder stood over the bodies one last time, committing every detail to memory. The faces of the dead would haunt him until justice was served, or until he joined them in the grave. Hoskins was already mounted, studying the ground with the intensity of a man reading scripture. His eyes tracked the faint impressions left in the hardpan, the disturbed pebbles, the barely visible signs that most men would miss entirely. They headed north, he said, pointing toward the canyon mouth. 8 riders, maybe 9. 1 horse carrying double, likely the woman. They're moving fast but not panicked, confident. Overconfident, Ethan corrected, swinging into his saddle. That'll be their downfall. The posse rode out as the sun broke fully over the horizon. 6 men against unknown numbers, tracking killers across some of the most unforgiving territory in the West. The odds weren't good, but Ethan had faced worse. At least, he told himself that. The trail led them into the canyon, a twisting maze of red rock and shadow that swallowed them whole. The walls rose 100 feet on either side, so narrow in places that the horses had to walk single file. Their hoofbeats echoed off the stone like distant thunder. "Perfect place for an ambush," muttered Frank Morrison, a rancher who'd volunteered for the posse. His hand never left his rifle. "They're not waiting to ambush us," Ethan said. "They think we're chasing Apaches, remember? They don't know we're coming." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. Men smart enough to stage a massacre were smart enough to cover their tracks. What if this was exactly what they wanted? What if the trail was a trap? Hoskins called back from the front. "Trail splits here. Main group went west. 2 riders broke off east." Ethan rode forward to examine the fork. "How long ago?" "Hard to say. Maybe 6, 8 hours. The eastern track is fainter. Those riders were moving lighter, probably carrying the gold." It was a classic outlaw tactic. Split the pursuers or split the loot, make it harder to catch everyone. Ethan made his decision quickly. "Morrison, take Peters and follow the eastern trail. Track them but don't engage. We need to know where they're going, who they're meeting. The rest of us stay on the main group. That's where the woman is." Morrison nodded and split off with Peters, a young deputy from Copper Ridge who'd barely started shaving. Ethan watched them disappear around a bend in the canyon, hoping he hadn't just sent them to their deaths. The remaining 4 riders pushed on. The canyon eventually opened into a hidden valley, green with cottonwoods and fed by a spring. Signs of the Outlaws' passage were everywhere. Trampled grass, horse droppings still fresh, the remains of a small camp. "They rested here," Hoskins said, dismounting to examine the site. "Maybe an hour, watered the horses, ate, and look here." He pointed to a spot beneath a tree where the grass was flattened. Someone sat here. Small frame. Had to be the woman. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. She'd been alive then, but that was hours ago, and hours in the hands of men like these could mean the difference between survival and a shallow grave. "Blood?" he asked, dreading the answer. Hoskins shook his head. "No blood. No signs of violence here. Whatever they're planning for her, they haven't done it yet." It was small comfort, but Ethan took it anyway. They rode out of the valley, following the trail west. The terrain grew rougher, the desert reasserting its dominance. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into something thick and heavy that sat in the lungs like wet cotton. By midday, they'd covered 15 miles of brutal landscape. The horses were starting to flag, their heads hanging low despite the frequent water breaks. Ethan knew they couldn't maintain this pace indefinitely, but stopping meant letting the outlaws get farther ahead. "Sheriff?" Hoskins had stopped his horse, staring at something on the ground. Ethan rode up beside him. There, caught on a piece of dried cholla cactus, was another scrap of blue fabric, bigger this time, deliberately torn and left behind. "She's marking the trail," Hoskins said with something like admiration in his voice. "Smart woman." "If they catch her doing it, they'll kill her," Ethan said grimly, but he carefully folded the fabric and tucked it into his saddlebag alongside the first piece. Evidence. Proof that Clara Whitfield had been here, that she'd been alive and thinking clearly enough to leave signs. It made him respect her even more. It made the urgency of finding her burn hotter. They pushed on through the afternoon heat. The landscape became increasingly desolate, all sharp rocks and endless sand punctuated by skeletal Joshua trees that looked like the damned reaching toward heaven. Vultures circled overhead, patient and knowing. As the sun began its descent, they reached the edge of what Hoskins called the furnace, a vast expanse of alkali flats that stretched to the horizon like a white sea. The heat rising from it created shimmering mirages, phantom lakes that promised water and delivered only more thirst. "They crossed it," Hoskins said, pointing to tracks leading straight into that hellish landscape. "Recently, too. Maybe this morning." Ethan studied the flats with growing concern. "How far across?" 10 miles, maybe 12. No water, no shade. We go out there now, in this heat. We might not make it. And if we wait until morning, we lose half a day on them." The men looked at each other, the weight of the decision hanging between them. Finally, Samuel Briggs, a tough old prospector who'd seen more than his share of hard country, spat into the dust and said, "I didn't ride all this way to turn back now. We water the horses good, fill every canteen, and we cross. Tonight, in the cool." Ethan looked at each man in turn. Hoskins nodded. Young Tommy Chen, the last member of their reduced posse, swallowed hard, but nodded too. "We rest until sunset," Ethan decided. "Then we cross in the dark. It'll be slower, but we'll survive it." They found what meager shade they could and settled in to wait. The horses were unsaddled and allowed to rest. Canteens were topped off from their dwindling water supply. The men ate dried meat and hardtack in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. Ethan sat apart from the others, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon. He thought about Clara Whitfield, wondering what kind of hell she was enduring, wondering if she was still alive to endure anything at all. "You think we'll find her in time?" Tommy Chen had approached quietly, his young face troubled. "I don't know," Ethan answered honestly, "but I know we'll find her, and when we do, those men will answer for what they've done." What if she's already dead, Sheriff?" "Then we bring her home anyway. Give her a proper burial. Let her family know the truth." Ethan's voice was hard. "And we make sure the men who killed her swing from a rope." Tommy nodded and returned to the others. Ethan remained alone with his thoughts as the day bled into evening. When the sun finally disappeared and the temperature began to drop, they saddled up. The alkali flats glowed ghostly white in the starlight, stretching endlessly before them. "Stay close," Ethan ordered. "Ethan, if someone gets separated out there, we might not find them again." They rode into the furnace in single file, Hoskins leading. The alkaline dust rose with each hoofbeat, coating everything in fine white powder that got into noses and throats and made breathing painful. The horses hated it, tossing their heads and snorting. The crossing was a surreal nightmare. In the darkness, distance became meaningless. They could have been riding for hours or minutes. There was no way to tell. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant. The only sounds were the crunch of hooves on alkali crust and the labored breathing of horses and men alike. Somewhere around what Ethan guessed was midnight, Briggs's horse stumbled and went down. The old prospector rolled clear, cursing fluently. "You hurt?" Ethan called. "Just my pride. Horse stepped in a damn hole." They gathered around the fallen animal. It had snapped its leg, the bone jutting through skin at an ugly angle. The horse's eyes rolled white with pain and fear. Briggs drew his pistol without hesitation and put a bullet between those eyes. The shot echoed across the flats like a thunderclap, then faded into oppressive silence. "Sorry, old girl," Briggs muttered, holstering his weapon. "Tommy, I'm riding double with you." They redistributed the weight and pressed on, now down to 3 horses. The furnace seemed endless, a purgatory of white dust and darkness. Ethan's eyes burned from the alkali, His throat felt like sandpaper, but finally, after what felt like an eternity, the ground began to change. The white crust gave way to regular sand and rock. Vegetation appeared, sparse at first, then increasingly thick. They'd made it across. As dawn broke, they found themselves at the edge of a dry riverbed lined with cottonwoods. The horses smelled water and surged forward, finding a few stagnant pools left in the deepest parts of the channel. "Let them drink," Ethan said, "but not too much too fast." While the horses recovered, the men collapsed in the shade. They'd made it across the furnace, but the cost was high. One horse dead, their water nearly gone, and every man looking gaunt and exhausted. Hoskins was already searching for the trail. He found it quickly. The outlaws had stopped here too, probably for the same reason. "They're maybe 8 hours ahead now," he reported. "We gained some time crossing at night." "Where are they headed?" Ethan asked. Hoskins studied the tracks, the surrounding terrain, the distant mountains. "If I had to guess? Salt Creek. Old mining settlement, mostly abandoned. It's the only place within a day's ride that has water and cover." Ethan knew Salt Creek by reputation, a lawless hole where outlaws and deserters gathered when they needed to disappear for a while. Going there with 4 tired men and 3 exhausted horses wasn't smart, but smart had stopped being an option the moment Clara Whitfield was taken. "How far?" 20 miles, maybe 25. We could make it by nightfall if we push hard." They rested for 2 hours, then mounted up and rode out. The morning was already hot, the sun a white disk of fury in the cloudless sky. The landscape was broken and hostile, all arroyos and rock formations that forced them to constantly adjust their course. Around midday, Tommy Chen spotted something and called out. They rode over to find what at first looked like a bundle of rags. It was Clara's bonnet, torn and dirty, but unmistakable. "She's still leaving signs," Hoskins said, "and the outlaws haven't noticed. That takes guts." Ethan picked up the bonnet, feeling the fabric between his fingers. There was dried blood on it, not much, but enough to make his jaw clench. She was hurt. How badly? He couldn't tell. "We're close," he said, packing the bonnet carefully with the other pieces of evidence. "Keep sharp." They rode through the afternoon heat, every man scanning the horizon for signs of ambush. The trail led through increasingly rough country, narrow defiles where a single rifleman could hold off an army, boulder fields that could hide a dozen men. But no attack came. As the sun began its descent, they crested a ridge and saw Salt Creek spread out below them. The settlement looked exactly as Ethan had imagined, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a dry creek bed, with a single cantina that still showed signs of life. And in the corral beside the cantina, 8 horses stood in the shade. "That's them," Hoskins breathed. "Has to be." Ethan studied the layout carefully. The cantina was the central building, with clear sightlines in all directions. The other structures were abandoned shells, windows gaping dark and empty. Getting close without being seen would be nearly impossible. "We wait for dark," he decided. "Then we move in quiet. I want prisoners if possible. We need them to talk, to tell us where the others went with the gold. But if it comes to shooting, you put them down and don't hesitate." The men settled in to wait, checking their weapons and preparing for what was coming. Ethan counted bullets, 18 rounds for his Winchester, 6 in his Colt, and another 6 in the cylinder he carried as backup. It would have to be enough. As twilight deepened, they moved down the ridge on foot, leaving the horses hobbled and hidden. The approach to Salt Creek was agonizingly slow, using every scrap of cover to avoid being spotted. They were 50 yards from the cantina when the door opened and a man stepped out, tall, dressed in black, with pale eyes that swept the surrounding darkness with predatory awareness. Ethan recognized him from wanted posters. Doyle Riker, wanted in 3 territories for murder, robbery, and crimes too numerous to list. The reward on his head was $5,000, dead or alive, preferably dead, as far as Ethan was concerned. Riker stood on the cantina's porch for a long moment as if sensing something wrong. Then he turned and went back inside, the door closing behind him. "That was too close," Briggs whispered. Ethan nodded. "Spread out. Cover the exits. When I give the signal, we move in fast and hard. Remember, Clara Whitfield is in there somewhere. Watch your shots." The men dispersed into the shadows. Ethan moved to the front of the cantina, his Winchester ready. Through the dirty window, he could see shapes moving inside, heard the murmur of voices, rough laughter. He was about to give the signal when a scream split the night, a woman's scream, raw with terror and pain. Ethan didn't think. He kicked in the door and charged inside, the Winchester coming up to his shoulder. The interior of the cantina erupted into chaos. Riker was at a table with 3 other men. A 5th man, the scarred one called Vance, had Clara by the hair, dragging her across the floor. Her dress was torn, her face bruised. She was fighting like a wildcat, but Vance was too strong. Time seemed to slow. Ethan saw Riker's hand drop to his gun, saw the other outlaws scrambling for weapons, saw Clara's eyes go wide as she spotted him. "Federal law!" Ethan roared. "Drop your weapons!" Riker's response was to draw and fire. The bullet whined past Ethan's ear and punched through the wall behind him. Then the cantina became hell. Ethan fired the Winchester, working the lever action with practiced speed. His first shot took Vance in the chest, dropping him instantly. The scarred man's grip on Clara released and he fell backward, blood spreading across his shirt. Hoskins came through the back door, his shotgun booming. The double load of buckshot caught one of the outlaws and literally threw him across the room. Riker overturned this table for cover and returned fire, his shots precise and deadly. Tommy Chen took a bullet in the shoulder and went down, crying out in pain. Briggs fired from the doorway, forcing another outlaw to dive behind the bar. Glass shattered. Bottles exploded. The air filled with gun smoke and the deafening roar of gunfire. Clara crawled across the floor toward the overturned table, trying to find cover. A bullet gouged the wood inches from her head and she screamed again. Ethan moved forward, firing methodically. Another outlaw went down, clutching his stomach and moaning. The one behind the bar popped up to shoot, and Hoskins' second shotgun blast caught him full in the face. Then Ethan saw him. Jack Morley, the prisoner, trying to slip out a side door. He swung the Winchester around. "Don't move!" Morley froze, hands raised. "Don't shoot! I'm not armed! I was a prisoner! They forced me! Save it for the judge!" A bullet burned across Ethan's ribs and he staggered, nearly dropping the rifle. Riker had flanked him somehow, was firing from behind a support pillar. Ethan dove behind a table as more shots tore through the air where he'd been standing. The cantina owner, old Diego, was hiding behind the bar, shouting in Spanish and begging everyone to stop shooting. Briggs took careful aim and put a round through the pillar, splintering wood. Riker pulled back, reloading. "Give it up, Riker," Ethan called out. "You're done." "Like hell I am." More shots, more screams. The Mexican gunfighter, Chavez, came up the stairs firing 2 pistols at once. Hoskins caught him with the shotgun, and he tumbled down the stairs in a tangle of limbs. And then, suddenly, it was quiet. The gun smoke hung thick in the air. Ears rang from the concussion of gunfire in the enclosed space. Bodies lay everywhere. Ethan counted quickly, 4 outlaws down. Riker was still behind the pillar, wounded but alive. Ethan could hear his labored breathing. Morley was still at the side door, hands raised. The half-breed, Wolf, was nowhere to be seen. "Hoskins, check on Tommy. Briggs, watch Morley." Ethan approached Riker's position carefully, the Winchester leveled. "It's over. Come out with your hands up." Silence. Then Riker's voice, strained with pain but still defiant. "You know what the funny thing is, Sheriff? The woman, she's not even why I'm here. The gold is. Always was. She's just collateral damage. Step out. Now. Or what? You'll shoot me? You're going to do that anyway. If you cooperate, you'll get a trial. A rope instead of a bullet. That's more than you deserve." Riker laughed, a wet, bubbling sound. "A rope? How civilized." He paused. "Tell me something, Sheriff. Was it worth it? Chasing us all this way? Getting your men killed? For what? Justice?" "For her," Ethan said, nodding toward Clara. "And for the men you murdered." "Noble, stupid, but noble." Then Riker stepped out, both hands visible and empty. His shirt was soaked with blood from a wound in his side. His face was pale, but his eyes still held that cold, reptilian intelligence. "I'm out. Now what?" "Now you get to live long enough to face a judge," Riker smiled. "We'll see about that." He moved fast, faster than a wounded man should have been able to. His hand dropped to a hidden ankle holster, coming up with a derringer. Ethan fired. The Winchester bullet took Riker in the chest, spinning him around. He fell hard, the derringer clattering from his hand. He lay on his back, blood pooling beneath him, his breathing shallow and rapid. Ethan approached carefully, kicking the derringer away. He knelt beside the dying outlaw. "Where's the gold? Where did your men take it?" Riker's smile was bloody. "Go to hell. You first." The light faded from Doyle Riker's eyes. His final breath rattled out and he went still. Ethan stood, feeling nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, just bone-deep exhaustion and the knowledge that it wasn't over yet. He turned to find Clara standing behind him, shaking but upright. She stared at Riker's body with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. "Miss Whitfield," he said gently, "you're safe now." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and tears began streaming down her bruised face. "I knew someone would come. I knew it." "You're very brave, ma'am. The signs you left, they helped us track you." "The others," she said urgently. "There were more of them. They split up, took the gold." "We know. We have men tracking them." Clara swayed suddenly, and Ethan caught her before she fell. "Easy. When did you last eat? Drink water?" I don't remember." Hoskins appeared with a canteen. "Tommy's going to make it." Bullet went clean through. Briggs is securing the prisoner. Ethan helped Clara to a chair and made her drink slowly. The water seemed to revive her somewhat. "How many more?" he asked. "How many men split off with the gold?" 4. Cole, Mercer, and 2 others I didn't know their names. They went east. That matches what we saw. Ethan looked at Hoskins. "Morrison and Peters are tracking them. If Luck's with us, they're watching them right now. And if Luck's not with us, then we've got more graves to dig." They spent the next hour securing the scene. The outlaws' bodies were dragged outside. Tommy Chen's shoulder was bandaged. Morley was tied to a chair, protesting his innocence the entire time. "I was a prisoner," he kept insisting. "They forced me to help them. I should be released." "You staged that massacre to look like an Indian attack," Ethan said coldly. "I heard Miss Whitfield's testimony. You're going to hang Morley. The only question is whether it's for murder or for treason, because that fake Apache attack could have started a war." Morley's face went white. He stopped protesting. Diego, the cantina owner, emerged from behind the bar looking shell-shocked. "Senor Sheriff, I had no choice. Riker, he comes here, he takes what he wants. I am just an old man." "I believe you, Diego, but you're going to tell me everything you know about Riker's operation. Every hideout, every contact, every place he might have stashed stolen goods." The old man nodded eagerly, grateful to be cooperating rather than arrested. As dawn approached, Clara had recovered enough to give a full statement. She described the ambush in detail, how it had been planned, how they'd staged it, everything Morley had said about making it look like an Apache attack. "They were going to start a war," she said, her voice shaking. "All those people who would have died, soldiers, Indians, innocent families, all so they could escape with gold. But they didn't escape," Ethan said, "and now the truth will be known. The Apache won't be blamed, and these men will face justice." A rider appeared just after dawn, Morrison, returning from tracking the eastern group. He looked haggard, but triumphant. "Found them, Sheriff, holed up in an old mining camp in the Broken Hills about 40 miles northeast. They've got the gold, and they're not going anywhere. Peters is watching them." Ethan felt a grim satisfaction. "Good work. How many?" 4, like the woman said. They're dug in pretty good, but they don't know we're watching them." "Then we've got the advantage." Ethan stood, his decision made. "Hoskins, you take Miss Whitfield and the prisoner back to Copper Ridge. Get her to the doctor, get Morley to a jail cell. Morrison and I will ride to the Broken Hills and finish this. Sheriff, you can't go after 4 men with just Morrison. Take Briggs at least. Briggs needs to help you with the prisoner transport, and Tommy can't ride with that shoulder." Ethan checked his weapons. "Besides, Morrison and I aren't going to fight them. We're going to wait for reinforcements from Redemption Springs. Their marshal will want in on this. It's his jurisdiction." It was a sensible plan, even if Ethan had no intention of following it. But he needed to get Clara to safety, and he needed Morley secured. The rest could be handled later. Clara stood, steadier now. She walked over to Ethan and took his hand. "Thank you, Sheriff, for not giving up, for coming after me." "It's my job, ma'am." "No," she said firmly. "It was more than that. You risked your life, your men's lives. That's not just duty. That's courage." Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. They prepared to ride out, splitting into two groups. Hoskins would take Clara, Morley, Tommy, and Briggs back to Copper Ridge, a 3-day journey if they took it slow. Ethan and Morrison would head to the Broken Hills. As they mounted up, Clara called out one more time. "Sheriff Calder, when this is over, when you've caught them all, you come to Redemption Springs. Let me thank you properly. Let the town thank you." "I'll do that, Miss Whitfield." He watched them ride south, Clara sitting tall despite her ordeal, refusing to be broken. Then he turned his horse north toward the Broken Hills and the final reckoning that awaited there. Morrison rode beside him in silence for a while before finally speaking. "You're not waiting for reinforcements, are you?" "No." "Didn't think so. We gonna die doing this?" Ethan considered the question honestly. "Probably." Morrison nodded. "Fair enough. Just wanted to know what I was getting into." They rode on through the morning heat, following the trail that would lead them to the last of Riker's gang. The desert stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Somewhere ahead, 4 men sat guarding stolen gold, thinking themselves safe. They were wrong. The hunt wasn't over. Not yet. And Ethan Calder had never left a job unfinished. The desert had swallowed Clara Whitfield whole, or so it seemed in those first terrible hours after Riker abandoned her. It had happened suddenly, without warning or explanation. The gang had been riding hard through a narrow canyon when Riker simply pulled his horse to a stop and turned those cold blue eyes on her. "End of the line, schoolteacher." Cole had dumped her from the saddle without ceremony. She hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. By the time she could breathe again, the sound of hoofbeats was already fading. "Wait!" she'd screamed, struggling to her feet. "You can't leave me here!" But they could, and they did. Within minutes, the canyon had swallowed them, and Clara was alone with nothing but the clothes on her back, bruises covering her body, and miles of hostile wilderness in every direction. She'd stood there for a long time, fighting down panic, forcing herself to think. The sun was merciless overhead. She had no water, no food, no weapon. The nearest settlement could be days away in any direction, if she even chose the right direction. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to pick a direction and move. But she'd read enough accounts of people dying in the desert to know that panic killed faster than thirst. She needed to find water first, find shelter, then worry about rescue. The canyon offered shade, at least. Clara pressed herself against the rock wall where the shadow was deepest and tried to calm her racing heart. She'd survived the ambush, survived days with the gang. She could survive this too. She had to. Hours passed. The sun tracked across the sky, the shadow moving with it. Clara moved when she had to, staying in the shade, conserving what moisture remained in her body. Her lips cracked and bled. Her tongue felt thick and useless in her mouth. As evening approached, she began to explore the canyon, looking for anything that might help. She found nothing but rock and sand and the bleached bones of some long-dead animal. When darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. Clara huddled against a boulder, wrapping her torn dress around herself as tightly as possible. The cold seeped into her bones. She shivered violently, teeth chattering, certain she wouldn't survive the night. But somehow she did. Dawn came gray and uncertain. Clara's body ached everywhere. Her head pounded. Moving required tremendous effort, but she forced herself upright and continued searching. That's when she found the spring. It was barely a trickle, seeping from a crack in the canyon wall and forming a small pool no bigger than a dinner plate. The water was cloudy and tasted of minerals, but it was water. Clara drank carefully, remembering warnings about drinking too much too fast. The liquid was the most beautiful thing she'd ever experienced. She drank again an hour later, and again after that. The water kept her alive, but it couldn't give her strength she didn't have. By the second day, hunger was a constant, gnawing presence. By the third, she could barely stand. She was dying slowly, and she knew it. On the fourth day, she heard the horse. At first, Clara thought it was a hallucination, her desperate mind creating sounds that weren't there. But the rhythmic clop of hooves on stone grew louder, more distinct. Someone was coming through the canyon. She tried to call out, but her damaged throat could barely manage a whisper. She stumbled toward the sound instead, using the canyon wall for support. The rider appeared around a bend, a single man on a paint horse leading a pack mule. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn buckskins and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. A rifle rested across his saddle, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who knew this country intimately. He saw her and pulled the horse to an immediate stop. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Clara took in his weathered face, the gray threading through his dark beard, eyes the color of storm clouds that had seen too much. He looked at her torn dress, her bruised face, the desperate state of her. "Help," Clara managed to croak. "Please." The man dismounted in one fluid motion and approached cautiously, as if she were a spooked animal that might bolt. Up close, she could see the concern in his eyes beneath the wariness. "Easy now," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You're hurt bad. How long you been out here?" 4 days, I think. Lost count." He unslung a canteen from his shoulder and held it to her lips. Slow sips, not too much at once. The water was cool and clean, nothing like the mineral-tainted spring. Clara wanted to gulp it down but forced herself to obey, taking small swallows. "What happened to you?" he asked, studying her injuries with a practiced eye. "Who did this?" "Outlaws. Ambushed the stagecoach, killed everyone, took me." The words came in broken fragments. "Then left me here." Something changed in the man's expression, a hardening, a coldness that settled over his features like a mask. "How many?" 8, maybe 9. They split up. Some went one way with the gold, others— She swayed suddenly, vision going dark around the edges. The man caught her before she fell. "All right, that's enough talking. You need food and rest before anything else." He helped her to a flat area nearby and made her sit while he unsaddled the horse and unloaded the mule. With efficient movements, he built a small fire and started heating something in a battered pot. The smell made Clara's stomach clench with desperate hunger. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated as if the question surprised him. "Lucas. Lucas Hale." "I'm Clara Whitfield. I was going to Redemption Springs to teach school." Lucas stirred whatever was cooking in the pot. "Long way from Redemption Springs." "The gang. They took me north. I don't even know where we are." "Blackstone Canyon. About 60 miles north of Salt Creek, 100 miles from anything resembling civilization." He ladled some of the pot's contents into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Slow sips again. Your stomach's been empty too long." It was some kind of thin stew, mostly broth with a few pieces of dried meat. It tasted like the finest meal Clara had ever eaten. She forced herself to sip slowly, though every instinct wanted to devour it. Lucas watched her eat, his expression unreadable. "You said they split up, the Outlaws." Clara nodded. 4 went east with the strongbox, the rest went to Salt Creek. Their leader was named Riker, Doyle Riker. She saw Lucas's jaw tighten at the name. "You know him?" "Know of him. Man's got a reputation that stretches from here to Texas. Murder, robbery, worse things." He poked at the fire with a stick. "The law after them?" "I don't know. Maybe. I left signs when I could. Pieces of my dress, my bonnet. But I don't know if anyone found them. If they did, and if they're worth their salt, they'll have tracked you to Salt Creek at least." Lucas stood and walked to his pack, pulling out a blanket. "You need rest. Real rest. We'll talk more when you've slept." Clara wanted to protest, to ask 1,000 questions, but exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. Lucas spread the blanket near the fire and helped her lie down. The last thing she remembered was the crackling of flames and the sound of Lucas's voice, low and steady, telling her she was safe now. When she woke, the sun was high overhead and Lucas was gone. Panic seized her for a moment until she spotted him returning from deeper in the canyon, his canteen freshly filled. He'd also brought back a handful of prickly pear fruits, carefully cleaned of their spines. "You let me sleep," Clara said, sitting up. Her body still ached, but the rest had helped. "You needed it," Eat these. He handed her the fruits. Not much, but they'll help. As Clara ate, Lucas began breaking camp with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown before. He worked without wasted motion, a man accustomed to being alone and taking care of himself. "Where are you going?" Clara asked. "We are going to a place I know. Another 20 miles west, there's a cabin, supplies. You can recover there properly." "You live out here? Alone?" "Have for near 10 years now, since the war ended." He finished loading the mule and turned to her. "You strong enough to ride?" Clara stood, testing her legs. They trembled but held. "I can manage." Lucas helped her onto the paint horse and swung up behind her. Clara tensed at the proximity. She'd been handled roughly by too many men in recent days. But Lucas kept his touch impersonal, professional, one arm around her waist, only to keep her steady as they rode. They left the canyon and headed west across broken country. Lucas seemed to know every rock and ravine, guiding the horse with unconscious skill. The mule followed behind, placid and untroubled. "Why do you live out here?" Clara asked after a while. "Away from everyone?" Lucas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Civilization and I parted ways. Seemed better for everyone if I stayed scarce." "What happened?" "The war happened, and what came after?" His voice carried old pain, carefully buried but never quite gone. "Lost people I cared about. Did things I'm not proud of. When it was over, I just kept walking. Ended up here. Found I preferred the desert to people." Clara understood that kind of loss, even if her own experience paled in comparison. "I'm sorry." "Long time ago now." They rode in silence after that. The sun beat down mercilessly, but Clara barely noticed. She was focused on staying conscious, on not sliding from the saddle. Lucas seemed to sense her struggle and adjusted his hold, keeping her secure. When they finally reached the cabin, Clara was drifting in and out of awareness. She had vague impressions of being helped down, of being led inside to a narrow cot, of a cool cloth being pressed to her forehead. Then she slept again, deep and dreamless. The next days blurred together. Clara woke, ate what Lucas prepared, slept again. Slowly, her strength returned. The bruises faded from purple to yellow-green. The cuts healed. Her voice grew stronger. The cabin was small but well-maintained. One room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, shelves lined with supplies. Books filled one corner, their spines worn from repeated reading. A weapons rack held a rifle, a shotgun, and a repeating carbine, all meticulously clean. Lucas spent his days hunting, tending to the horses, repairing equipment. He spoke little, but his actions spoke volumes. He changed the dressing on Clara's wounds with gentle hands. He made sure she ate regularly. He gave her privacy when she needed it, and company when the silence became too much. On the 5th day at the cabin, Clara felt strong enough to venture outside. The landscape was harsh but held a stark beauty. Red rock formations, distant mountains, endless sky. Lucas's cabin sat in a small valley with a reliable spring and enough grazing for the horses. She found him chopping wood, his shirt discarded in the heat. Scars crisscrossed his back and torso, old injuries from blade and bullet. He looked up as she approached, reaching for his shirt with something like embarrassment. "Don't," Clara said. "I've seen worse. Endured worse." Lucas pulled the shirt on anyway. "You're looking stronger. I feel almost human again, thanks to you." She sat on a nearby rock. "Lucas, I need to get back to civilization, to report what happened, to make sure those men face justice." "I know, but I also know I can't make it alone. Not yet. Maybe not ever, through this country." Lucas set down the axe and faced her. "What are you asking?" "Take me to Redemption Springs, or Copper Ridge. Somewhere with law, with telegraph lines, please." He was quiet, his face unreadable. Then, "Tell me about the ambush again. Everything you remember." So Clara did. She described the attack in detail. The staged Apache signs, the casual brutality, the names she'd heard. She told him about the strongbox, about how the gang had split up, about Salt Creek. When she finished, Lucas walked to the edge of his property and stared out at the desert for a long time. Clara waited, giving him space to think. Finally, he turned back. Those men, Riker and his gang, they're not just killers. They're trying to start a war. If people believe Apaches attacked that coach, the army will retaliate. Innocent people will die. I know. The law might have caught some of them already, might not have. Either way, there's still men out there who need answering for. He met her eyes. I can take you to safety, get you to Redemption Springs in 3, maybe 4 days. But after that what? After that, I aim to find the ones who got away. Make sure they face justice, one way or another. Clara stood. The men who went east with the gold. You know where they'd go? Broken Hills, most likely. Old mining territory, plenty of places to hide. If they're smart, they're holed up waiting for things to cool down before they move the gold. And you'd go after them? 4 armed men? Lucas's expression was hard. I've faced worse odds. And they need to pay for what they did, not just to you, but to everyone who'll suffer if their lie stands. Clara walked over to him, studying his face. She saw the resolve there, the old warrior beneath the hermit exterior. But she also saw something else, a deep loneliness, a man who'd removed himself from humanity because he thought he didn't deserve to be part of it anymore. You're a good man, Lucas Hale, she said softly. Better than you think. You don't know what I've done. I know what you're doing now. That matters more. They left the next morning at dawn. Lucas had packed carefully, food, water, ammunition, medical supplies. He'd given Clara proper clothes to replace her ruined dress, buckskin pants, and a cotton shirt that hung loose on her frame. He'd also given her a pistol, a small revolver that fit her hand. You know how to use this? He'd asked. My father taught me. Long time ago. Don't use it unless you have to, but if you have to, don't hesitate. The journey to Redemption Springs took 4 days, just as Lucas had predicted. They traveled carefully, avoiding open ground, always watching for pursuit. Lucas's knowledge of the terrain was encyclopedic. He knew every water source, every shortcut, every place where danger might lurk. They talked more during those days than in all the previous time combined. Clara told him about Philadelphia, about her decision to come west, about her dreams of teaching children who had no other access to education. Lucas listened, asking occasional questions, seeming genuinely interested. In turn, he shared fragments of his own story. He'd been a cavalry officer during the war, had fought in brutal campaigns, had watched men he commanded die in ways that still haunted him. When the war ended, he'd gone home to find his wife dead from fever and his farm burned. With nothing left to hold him, he'd simply started walking west. Figured the desert was big enough to get lost in, he said. Turned out I was right. But you weren't lost, Clara countered. You were hiding. Maybe so. Either way, it worked until now. On the evening of the 4th day, they crested a ridge and saw Redemption Springs spread out below them. A proper town with a main street, shops, a church steeple rising above the other buildings. Smoke curled from chimneys. People moved along the boardwalks. It looked impossibly civilized after weeks in the wilderness. There's your new home, Lucas said. Such as it is. Clara felt a complicated mix of relief and sadness. Relief at reaching safety, sadness that their journey together was ending. In these few days, she'd come to trust Lucas more than she'd trusted anyone in a long time. They rode into town as the sun set. People stopped to stare. The strange mountain man and the woman in buckskins. They pulled up in front of the marshal's office. A man emerged, wearing a tin star and a suspicious expression. Help you folks? This is Clara Whitfield, Lucas said. She was on the Copper Ridge stage that got ambushed. She's the only survivor. The marshal's eyes went wide. Miss Whitfield? My heaven, we heard you were dead. There's been a whole uproar, talk of Apache raids, the army mobilizing. It wasn't Apaches, Clara said firmly. It was outlaws trying to make it look that way. I can tell you everything, but first I need to know, did anyone survive? Did the law catch them? The marshal helped her dismount. Sheriff Calder from Copper Ridge tracked them to Salt Creek. Had a shootout there. Killed several, including Doyle Riker himself. Captured one prisoner. But there were others that got away with the gold. Lucas and Clara exchanged glances. So the law had done its work, at least partially. Where's Sheriff Calder now? Clara asked. Headed to the Broken Hills with one of his men, after the rest of the gang. The marshal shook his head. Fool's errand, if you ask me. 2 men against 4 in territory like that. But Calder's stubborn. Won't quit till the job's done or he's dead. Lucas dismounted slowly. The Broken Hills. You know exactly where. Old mining camp near Eagle Peak. But, mister, I wouldn't recommend. Lucas was already checking his weapons, his face set with determination. Clara grabbed his arm. You're going after them, to help the sheriff. Have to. Like you said, they need to answer for what they did. It's not your fight, Lucas. You don't owe anyone anything. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something like peace in his eyes. Maybe not. But I'm done hiding from fights that matter. I'm done pretending the world doesn't need men willing to stand against evil. He touched her shoulder gently. You taught me that. These past days, watching your courage, your refusal to give up, you reminded me what it means to do the right thing, even when it's hard. Clara felt tears threatening. Don't go. Stay here. You've done enough. Not yet, I haven't. Lucas turned to the marshal. You take care of Miss Whitfield. Get her statement. Keep her safe. If I'm not back in a week, assume the worst. Sir, I really must advise. But Lucas was already mounting his horse. He looked down at Clara one more time. Thank you for reminding me who I used to be, who I can still be. Lucas, wait. He touched the brim of his hat in a small salute, then wheeled the horse around and galloped out of town, heading northeast toward the Broken Hills and whatever fate awaited him there. Clara stood watching until he disappeared into the gathering darkness. The marshal cleared his throat awkwardly. Miss Whitfield, we should get you inside. The doctor needs to look at you, and we need your full statement about the ambush. But Clara couldn't stop staring at the empty road. She'd been saved by a hermit who'd wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his ghosts. And now he was riding toward danger, maybe toward death, because she'd somehow convinced him that his life still had purpose. He's going to get himself killed, she whispered. The marshal didn't argue. They both knew it was likely true. But as Clara finally allowed herself to be led inside, she held on to one thought. Lucas Hale might be a solitary man, might be haunted by his past, but he was also brave and skilled and driven by a fierce sense of justice. If anyone could help Sheriff Calder finish this, it was him. And somewhere in the wilderness between Redemption Springs and the Broken Hills, 2 lawmen she'd never met were about to receive help from the most unexpected source imaginable. The hunt was entering its final phase, and every piece was moving into position for the reckoning that would decide everything. The Broken Hills rose from the desert floor like the shattered remnants of some ancient catastrophe, a maze of ravines and collapsed mine shafts where the earth had been torn open and left to bleed. Ethan Calder and Frank Morrison had been watching the old mining camp for 2 days now, lying on their bellies on a ridge overlooking the collection of ramshackle buildings that clung to the hillside like barnacles on a dying ship. 4 men, 4 horses, and somewhere in that camp, a strongbox containing enough gold to make desperate men do terrible things. They're getting nervous, Morrison whispered, his spyglass trained on the camp below. Cole's been checking the perimeter every hour. Mercer barely sleeps. They know something's wrong. Ethan lowered his own glass and wiped sweat from his forehead. The sun was merciless up here, no shade to speak of, and the water in their canteens was running dangerously low. Peters, who'd been maintaining the watch from a different vantage point, had signaled earlier that morning. The Outlaws were preparing to move. They'll make a run for it soon, Ethan said. Question is where? Mexico's 3 days south. They could disappear across the border and we'd never see them again. So we hit them now, before they can leave. 4 against 2, in a camp they've had time to fortify. Those aren't good odds. Morrison spat into the dust. Odds haven't been good since we started this chase, Sheriff. Hasn't stopped us yet. Ethan had to smile at that. Morrison was right. They'd come too far, risked too much to turn back now. Clara Whitfield was safe. Riker was dead. Morley was in custody. But until these last 4 men answered for their crimes, the job wasn't finished. We wait for dark, Ethan decided. Move in quiet, take them while they're sleeping. If we're lucky, we can secure at least 2 before they know we're there. And if we're not lucky? Then we die trying. They settled in to wait for nightfall, taking turns watching the camp and resting. Ethan's mind drifted as the afternoon heat bore down. He thought about Clara's face when he'd found her in that cantina, the relief and terror mixing in her eyes. He thought about the men he'd killed at Salt Creek, wondering if their ghosts would haunt him or if they deserved their fate so completely that even the dead would consider it justice. Mostly he thought about the thin line he'd been walking since this all began, the line between law and vengeance, between duty and obsession. He'd told himself he was bringing criminals to justice, but somewhere along the trail it had become personal. These men had offended something deep in his soul, had violated the very idea of civilization that he'd spent his career trying to uphold in this savage land. They needed to pay, not just legally, but completely. Finally. Forever. The sun crawled toward the western horizon with agonizing slowness. Ethan dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, his hand instinctively going to his gun. Morrison kept watch, his weathered face as patient and still as the rocks around them. Then, just as the sun touched the mountains and began painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Peters came scrambling up the ridge from his position, moving with urgent haste. "Sheriff," he hissed, "we got a problem." Ethan was instantly alert. "What is it?" "Rider coming from the southwest, moving fast. He'll reach the camp in maybe 20 minutes. Morrison cursed under his breath. "Reinforcements?" "Don't know. Single rider, leading no pack animals. Could be a scout, could be someone bringing news." Ethan grabbed his spyglass and trained it on the southwest approach. Sure enough, a lone figure on horseback was navigating the broken terrain with practiced ease, heading straight for the mining camp. "He reaches them, they'll know something's up," Morrison said. "Could spook them into running tonight instead of tomorrow. Or into setting up an ambush if they think law's closing in." Ethan made a quick decision. "Peters, get to the horses. If they bolt, we need to be ready to pursue. Morrison, you're with me. We intercept that rider before he reaches the camp." They scrambled down the backside of the ridge to where their horses waited, concealed in a shallow arroyo. The animals were tired and underfed, but they'd have to manage. Ethan and Morrison mounted and rode hard to cut off the approaching rider, using the broken terrain to stay hidden. They reached an intersecting ravine just as the rider entered it from the south. Ethan raised his rifle. "Hold it right there!" The rider pulled his horse to an immediate stop, hands moving away from his weapons. As Ethan and Morrison closed in, Ethan got his first good look at the man. Tall, lean, maybe 50 years old, with gray-threaded hair and the hard, weathered face of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He wore buckskins and carried a repeating carbine across his saddle, along with enough ammunition to fight a small war. But what caught Ethan's attention most were the man's eyes, storm gray and filled with a cold, focused intensity that Ethan recognized instantly. This was a man who'd seen combat, who knew how to kill, and who wouldn't hesitate if pushed. "State your business," Ethan ordered, keeping his rifle trained center mass. The rider's hand stayed visible and still. "Name's Lucas Hale. I'm looking for Sheriff Ethan Calder of Copper Ridge." Ethan and Morrison exchanged glances. "You found him. How'd you know I was here?" "Marshall in Redemption Springs told me. Said you'd gone to the Broken Hills to finish the job on Riker's gang." Lucas's eyes flicked to the ridge behind them, then back to Ethan. "You've been watching the mining camp. 4 men, 1 strongbox. You planning to take them tonight?" It wasn't a question. Ethan lowered his rifle slightly but kept it ready. "And what's your interest in this?" "Clara Whitfield." The name hit Ethan like a physical blow. "Miss Whitfield? What about her?" "I found her in Blackstone Canyon 4 days after Riker abandoned her, took her to my cabin, nursed her back to health, then brought her to Redemption Springs." Lucas's voice was flat, factual, but Ethan heard the undercurrent of anger beneath it. "She told me everything those men did. The ambush, the murders, the plan to start a war. I brought her to safety like she asked. Now I'm here to finish what needs finishing." Morrison spoke up. "You're not law. This isn't your jurisdiction. Don't care about jurisdiction. Care about justice." Lucas met Ethan's eyes directly. "Those men down there are part of the gang that destroyed Miss Whitfield's life and killed innocent people. They need to answer for that. I aim to make sure they do." Ethan studied him carefully. Everything in Lucas's bearing suggested he was telling the truth, and that he was dangerous in ways that went beyond just being handy with weapons. This was a man who'd seen war, who'd killed before, who carried the weight of old violence like a second skin. "You were cavalry," Ethan said, reading the signs. "Officer, if I'm guessing right." "Captain, 3rd Colorado. Served through the whole war and wished I hadn't." Lucas shifted in his saddle. "Look, Sheriff, I know you don't know me from Adam, but I'm offering my help. You've got 2 men, maybe 3, against 4 hardened killers in a fortified position. You need every gun you can get." Morrison leaned close to Ethan and whispered, "Could be a trick. Could be one of them." But Ethan was already shaking his head. "He's not one of them. Miss Whitfield wouldn't have trusted him if he was. And he's right. We need the help." He extended his hand to Lucas. "Welcome to the posse, Captain Hale, but you take orders from me. We do this clean and legal if possible." Lucas shook his hand, his grip firm and steady. "And if it's not possible? Then we do what needs doing and sort out the legalities later." They rode together back to the ridge where Peters waited. Ethan filled Lucas in on what they'd observed over the past 2 days: the layout of the camp, the routines of the 4 outlaws, the location of the strongbox. "Cole's the most dangerous," Ethan explained. "Fast with a gun, doesn't hesitate. Mercer's the cautious one, always checking their perimeter. The other 2, Dawson and Kyle, are followers. They'll fight if cornered, but they're not leaders." Lucas studied the camp through the spyglass. "They've got good sight lines from that main building. We try a frontal assault, they'll cut us down before we get close. Which is why we don't try a frontal assault." Ethan pointed to a collapsed mine shaft on the eastern edge of the camp. "That tunnel connects to at least 2 of the buildings. It's how they've been moving supplies without being visible. If we can get into that shaft, we can come up inside their perimeter." Morrison frowned. "That tunnel could be collapsed anywhere along its length. We could get trapped." "Could be," Ethan acknowledged, "but it's the only way to even the odds." Lucas was still studying the camp, his expression thoughtful. "We need a distraction, something to draw their attention while the main force goes through the tunnel." "What kind of distraction?" A thin smile crossed Lucas's face. "The kind that makes desperate men do stupid things. We make them think someone's coming for the gold from the front. While they're focused on that threat, the rest of you come up behind them." "That's a good way to get yourself killed," Morrison said. "Only if I do it wrong." But Lucas looked at Ethan. "I've run diversionary actions before. I know how to draw fire and stay alive doing it." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to say it was too risky, but the tactical part of his mind recognized that Lucas was right. They needed something to split the outlaws' attention. And Lucas, with his military experience, was the best choice for the job. "All right," Ethan agreed reluctantly, "but you don't engage unless absolutely necessary. Draw their attention, make some noise, then get clear. We'll handle the rest." "When do we move?" Ethan looked at the darkening sky. "Full dark in about 2 hours. That gives us time to get into position." They spent those 2 hours preparing. Weapons were checked and rechecked. Ammunition was distributed. They ate what little food remained and drank sparingly from nearly empty canteens. Lucas shared some hardtack from his saddlebags, and it disappeared quickly among the hungry men. As night fell, they moved into position. Lucas circled wide to approach the camp from the southwest, while Ethan, Morrison, and Peters made their way to the mine shaft entrance on the east side. The tunnel mouth was a dark, forbidding hole in the hillside, shored up with rotting timbers that looked ready to collapse at the slightest disturbance. Ethan lit a shielded lantern and stepped inside, Morrison and Peters following close behind. The air inside was stale and thick with dust. The tunnel was barely tall enough to walk upright, and in places they had to crouch to avoid the sagging ceiling. Support beams groaned ominously. Small rocks occasionally fell from above, pattering down like rain. "This is insane," Morrison muttered. "We're going to get buried alive." "Keep moving," Ethan ordered, though he shared Morrison's concern. One wrong step, one weak beam, and tons of rock would come crashing down. They navigated by the dim lantern light, following the tunnel as it wound through the hillside. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, they heard voices ahead, muffled but distinct. Ethan extinguished the lantern and they continued in darkness, feeling their way along the rough walls. The voices grew clearer. They were directly beneath one of the buildings now. Then, from outside the camp, a gunshot cracked through the night. Lucas had started the diversion. The effect was immediate. Above them, heavy footsteps pounded across floorboards. Voices shouted in alarm. "Someone's out there!" "How many?" "Can't tell. Grab your rifles." More shots from outside. Lucas firing deliberately, spacing his shots to sound like multiple attackers. The Outlaws responded with a volley of gunfire, concentrating on the southwest approach. Ethan found a trap door in the tunnel ceiling, the access point to the building above. He pushed it up slowly, carefully, creating just enough gap to see through. The room above was some kind of storage area, currently empty of people. The strongbox sat in the corner, heavily padlocked. Through the doorway, Ethan could see into the main room where the Outlaws were positioned at windows, firing into the darkness. "Now," Ethan whispered. He pushed the trapdoor fully open and hauled himself up, Winchester at the ready. Morrison and Peters followed, moving quickly and quietly. They were inside the camp, behind the Outlaws, with the element of surprise. Ethan stepped into the main room doorway. "Drop your weapons. You're under arrest." Cole spun around, his gun already in motion. Ethan fired first, the Winchester bucking against his shoulder. The shot took Cole high in the chest and knocked him backward through the window he'd been shooting from. The room erupted into chaos. Mercer dove behind an overturned table and returned fire. His bullet carved a furrow across Ethan's upper arm, burning like a brand. Morrison's shotgun boomed, the heavy load punching through the table and catching Mercer in the leg. The outlaw screamed and fell. Dawson and Kyle were at the far window, caught between the threat inside and Lucas's continuing fire from outside. Dawson made the fatal mistake of turning to face Ethan, his rifle coming up. Peter shot him twice, the young deputy's hand steady despite the fear on his face. Kyle threw down his weapon and raised his hands. "Don't shoot! I surrender!" "On the ground, now!" Ethan commanded. Kyle dropped to his knees, then flat on his belly, hands behind his head. Morrison moved to secure him while Ethan approached Mercer. The outlaw was bleeding badly from his leg, his face gray with shock and pain. "It's over," Ethan said. "Where's Cole?" Morrison checked the broken window. "Dead. Fell on his own knife when he went through." Outside, Lucas's rifle had gone silent. Ethan moved to the window cautiously, ready for a trap. But Lucas was approaching the building openly, his carbine lowered. "All clear out here," Lucas called. "You get them?" "3 down, 1 prisoner." Ethan holstered his weapon and allowed himself a moment to breathe. They'd done it. Against the odds, they'd actually done it. Peters was checking Mercer's wound. "This one needs a doctor, or he'll bleed out." "Then we better get him to one," Ethan said. He turned to Kyle, who was being tied up by Morrison. "Where were you planning to go? What was your route out?" Kyle swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the dead and wounded. "Mexico. We were going to Mexico through Devil's Gap, then south to the border. Please, Sheriff, I never killed nobody. I just held horses. That's all I did." "You participated in a robbery and staged a massacre that could have started a war. That's enough to hang you." Ethan's voice was iron. "But if you cooperate fully, testify against anyone else involved, maybe the judge will show mercy." "I'll testify. I'll tell you everything. Just don't hang me." Lucas had entered the building and was examining the strongbox. "This is it. The mining company payroll. Still locked tight." Ethan nodded. "We'll transport it back with the prisoner. The company can open it when we return it." He looked at his small, battered posse. Morrison had taken a grazing shot to the shoulder. Peters looked exhausted but unhurt. Lucas was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but otherwise seemed fine. And Ethan himself was running on fumes, his arm bleeding, his body screaming for rest. But they'd won. The hunt was over. They spent the rest of the night securing the camp and tending to wounds. Mercer's leg was bandaged as well as they could manage, though he needed proper medical attention soon. The bodies of Cole and Dawson were wrapped in canvas from the mining equipment. Kyle sat bound and miserable, contemplating his future at the end of a rope. As dawn broke over the broken hills, painting the landscape in shades of gold and rose, the 4 lawmen prepared to head back to civilization. The journey would take several days, slowed by injured men and prisoners, but they had time now. The urgency was gone. Lucas helped load the strongbox onto one of the outlaws' horses. "What happens now?" he asked Ethan. "Now we take these men back to face trial. We return the gold. We make sure everyone knows the truth about what happened, that it wasn't Indians, that it was a gang of murderers who nearly started a war for their own profit. Ethan extended his hand. And we make sure men like you get recognized for the help you gave. Lucas shook his hand, but his expression was uncertain. I'm not looking for recognition, Sheriff. Maybe not, but you deserve it anyway. Miss Whitfield was right about you. You're a good man, Captain Hale. Better than you give yourself credit for. Something shifted in Lucas's expression, the hard mask cracking slightly to reveal the man underneath. She said something similar. Maybe it's time I started believing it. They rode out as the sun climbed higher, a battered but victorious group. The desert stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Somewhere ahead lay Redemption Springs and Copper Ridge, towns where word would spread about the end of Riker's gang and the recovery of the stolen gold. But more importantly, word would spread about the truth, about the massacre that wasn't what it seemed, about the lawmen who refused to quit, about the mountain hermit who came out of hiding to help finish the fight. The trail back was long and hard. Mercer's condition worsened despite their efforts, and on the second day he succumbed to his wounds, dying quietly as they rode through a box canyon. They buried him in the sand with nothing but rocks to mark the grave. Kyle grew more talkative as they traveled, spilling names and details about other jobs Riker's gang had pulled, other people involved in the network of crime that had flourished in the lawless territories. Ethan listened and took notes, knowing that this information would lead to more arrests, more justice served. On the fourth day, they met a cavalry patrol out of Fort Dawson. The lieutenant in charge was a young man named Garrett, who'd been sent to investigate reports of Indian troubles. There's no Indian troubles, Ethan explained. There was a staged massacre designed to look like one, but we've caught the men responsible. He showed the officer the evidence. The strongbox, the prisoner, the full written statement Clara had given. Lieutenant Garrett's face grew darker as he read. These men tried to start a war, he said, his voice tight with anger. If you hadn't caught them, but we did, and now the truth can be told. Your superiors need to know that the Apache aren't responsible. Any retaliation would be a disaster. Garrett nodded grimly. I'll ride to the fort immediately. Get word to the colonel. There will be no action against the tribes. He looked at Ethan with new respect. You prevented something terrible, Sheriff. The whole territory owes you a debt. The cavalry patrol split off, riding hard for the fort. Ethan's group continued south toward Copper Ridge, moving slower now as exhaustion caught up with them all. On the evening of the sixth day, they saw the lights of Copper Ridge glowing in the distance. Ethan felt something release in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing its weight. They rode into town just after dark. People came out of their homes and businesses, staring at the weary riders, the strongbox, the prisoner. Word spread quickly that the sheriff had returned, that the job was done. The marshal's office became a center of controlled chaos. The prisoner was locked up. The strongbox was secured. Statements were taken. The doctor was summoned to treat wounds. And through it all, Ethan moved with methodical precision, making sure every detail was documented, every piece of evidence properly recorded. It was nearly midnight when he finally allowed himself to stop. Morrison had already collapsed on a cot in the back room. Peters had gone home to his worried wife. Lucas stood near the door, looking uncertain about whether to stay or go. You have a place to sleep? Ethan asked him. I'll make camp outside town. I'm not much for roofs anymore. Nonsense, there's a spare room at the boarding house. Clean bed, hot bath, you've earned it. Lucas hesitated, then nodded. Appreciate it, Sheriff. Ethan, after what we've been through, I think we're past formalities. A slight smile crossed Lucas's weathered face. Ethan, then. And I'm Lucas. They walked to the boarding house together, two exhausted men who'd faced death and somehow survived. Mrs. Henderson, the proprietor, took one look at them and immediately began preparing rooms and hot water without asking any questions. As Lucas headed upstairs to his room, Ethan called after him. Lucas, tomorrow, I need to write my full report for the territorial governor. I'll need your statement about finding Miss Whitfield and helping with the final confrontation. I'll be here. And after that, what will you do? Go back to your cabin? Lucas paused on the stairs, his hand on the railing. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. For 10 years I've been hiding from the world, but these past days, fighting alongside you and your men, helping to finish something that mattered. I felt alive again, felt like I had a purpose. The world needs good men, Lucas. Men willing to stand against evil when it would be easier to look away. You proved you're one of those men. Lucas nodded slowly. Maybe I'll head to Redemption Springs first. Check on Miss Whitfield. Make sure she's settling in all right. Ethan smiled knowingly. That sounds like a fine idea. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Ethan spent hours writing his report, documenting everything from the initial discovery of the ambush site to the final confrontation at the Broken Hills. Lucas provided his statement, speaking plainly about his role and motivations. By afternoon, messengers were riding out in all directions, to the territorial capital, to Fort Dawson, to Redemption Springs. The truth would spread faster than the lie ever could, preventing the war that Riker's gang had tried to start. The mining company sent representatives to reclaim their payroll, expressing profound gratitude for its recovery. The reward money, nearly $2,000, was divided among the posse members who'd participated. Lucas tried to refuse his share, but Ethan insisted. You earned it. Use it however you see fit. 3 days later, Clara Whitfield arrived in Copper Ridge, accompanied by the marshal from Redemption Springs. She looked healthier than when Ethan had last seen her, the bruises faded, her eyes clear and determined. She found Ethan in his office, working through the last of the paperwork. When he looked up and saw her, he stood immediately. Miss Whitfield, you didn't need to come all this way. Yes, I did. She crossed the room and took his hands in hers. I needed to thank you properly, for coming after me, for refusing to give up, for bringing those men to justice. It was my duty, ma'am. It was more than duty, Sheriff Calder. It was courage and determination and a refusal to let evil win. You saved my life. Her eyes glistened with tears. The school in Redemption Springs is beautiful. The children are wonderful. I start teaching next week, and none of that would have been possible without you. Ethan felt his throat tighten. I'm just glad you're safe, Miss Whitfield. That's all that matters. She smiled. Clara. Please call me Clara. Ethan. They stood there for a moment, two people whose lives had intersected in violence and pain, but who'd both emerged stronger for it. Is Lucas still in town? Clara asked. He is. Been helping around the office, actually. Turns out he's got a talent for organization. Ethan smiled. I think he's been avoiding heading back to his cabin. Good. He shouldn't be alone anymore. He's too good a man to waste his life in isolation. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Lucas appeared in the doorway. His eyes went wide when he saw Clara. Miss Whitfield, I didn't expect... it's good to see you. Clara crossed to him and embraced him without hesitation. Lucas stood stiffly for a moment, then slowly returned the embrace, his eyes closing. Thank you, Clara whispered, for everything, for saving me, for bringing me to safety, for finishing the fight. When they separated, Lucas looked uncomfortable with the emotion, but not unhappy. You're looking well? I am well, thanks to you and Sheriff Calder and all the brave men who refused to let those killers escape. She glanced between them. I'm having a small gathering in Redemption Springs next week, to celebrate the school opening and to thank everyone who helped. Will you both come? Ethan nodded. I'll be there. Lucas hesitated, then, I'd be honored. The following week, true to her word, Clara hosted a celebration in Redemption Springs. The whole town turned out, miners, ranchers, shopkeepers, families. A platform had been erected in the town square, and the territorial governor himself had made the journey to attend. The governor gave a speech praising the lawmen who'd broken up Riker's gang and prevented a catastrophic war. He specifically mentioned Ethan Calder, Frank Morrison, Tommy Chen, and Lucas Hale by name, calling them heroes of the territory. Ethan stood uncomfortably through the applause, unused to being the center of attention. But Lucas looked even more uncomfortable, as if he wanted to bolt from the crowd entirely. Then Clara took the stage. I want to tell you all a story, she began, her voice carrying across the square. It's a story about courage in the face of evil, about men who refused to quit when quitting would have been easier, about a frontier that's becoming civilized not through violence but through the rule of law and the determination of good people. She told the whole story, the ambush, the staged massacre, the hunt across the desert, the final confrontation. She spoke of Ethan's relentless pursuit, Morrison's loyalty, Peters's bravery. And she spoke of Lucas, the hermit who came out of hiding to help finish the fight. When she finished, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause that echoed through the streets. As the celebration continued into the evening with food and music and dancing, Ethan found himself standing with Lucas at the edge of the crowd. "You thinking about staying?" Ethan asked. "In civilization, I mean." Lucas watched Clara dancing with some of the children from her school, her face lit with genuine joy. "Maybe. Been thinking I could use my military pension to buy some land, start over. Maybe even—" He trailed off, but his eyes remained on Clara. Ethan smiled. "She's a remarkable woman." "That she is. And she clearly thinks well of you." Lucas turned to look at him. "You playing matchmaker, Sheriff?" "Just making observations. What you do with those observations is your own business." They stood in comfortable silence, two men who'd faced death together and survived. Around them, the celebration continued, proof that even in the harsh frontier, goodness could triumph over evil, and that law and justice could prevail when brave men stood together. The sun set over Redemption Springs, painting the sky in brilliant colors. And in that moment, with danger past and justice served, the future seemed bright with possibility. The celebration in Redemption Springs lasted well into the night, but as the music faded and families returned to their homes, the real work of rebuilding began. The frontier had been tested by violence and deception, and now it would prove whether civilization could truly take root in such unforgiving soil. In the weeks that followed, the territorial court convened to handle the prosecution of Jack Morley and Kyle Henderson, the two surviving members of Riker's gang. The courthouse in Silver Creek was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in the aisles and crowding outside the windows just to witness justice being served. Ethan Calder sat in the front row, his testimony already given, watching as the prosecutor methodically built his case. Clara Whitfield took the stand on the second day, her voice steady and clear as she recounted every detail of the ambush and its aftermath. She didn't flinch when describing the murders, didn't look away when the defense attorney tried to rattle her with aggressive questions. "Miss Whitfield," the attorney said with barely concealed condescension, "isn't it possible that in your traumatized state you misremembered certain details? That perhaps the men who took you were actually trying to protect you from genuine Apache raiders?" Clara's eyes flashed. "Sir, I know the difference between protection and captivity. I know the difference between salvation and terror. Those men killed the marshal and the driver in cold blood, then deliberately staged the scene to start a war. I watched Jack Morley instruct them on exactly how to make it look like an Indian attack. There is no misremembering. There is only truth." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge gavelled for silence. The defense had no real answer to that. The evidence was overwhelming. The recovered gold, the testimony of multiple witnesses, the physical proof that the massacre had been staged. When Kyle Henderson took the stand and confirmed every detail in exchange for a lighter sentence, the outcome became inevitable. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Jack Morley was found guilty on all counts: murder, robbery, conspiracy to incite war, and a dozen other charges. The judge sentenced him to hang within the month. Morley's face went white as the sentence was read, but he said nothing. He'd gambled with his life and lost. Kyle Henderson, in exchange for his cooperation and testimony, received 20 years hard labor. He wept as he was led from the courtroom in chains, but he was alive. That was more mercy than his victims had received. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered to hear the verdict. When word spread that justice had been served, a cheer went up that could be heard throughout the town. Ethan pushed through the crowd, seeking fresh air and solitude, but reporters and well-wishers surrounded him immediately. "Sheriff Calder, how does it feel to have brought down the entire Riker gang? Will you be pursuing other outlaws with the same determination? Is it true the territorial governor wants to appoint you as a U.S. Marshal?" Ethan held up his hands, overwhelmed. "Gentlemen, please, I was just doing my job. The real heroes are the men who rode with me. Frank Morrison, Tommy Chen, young Peters, and Lucas Hale, who came out of nowhere to help finish the fight." "Where's Captain Hale?" someone called out. "Last I heard, he'd purchased land near Redemption Springs, planning to settle down and start ranching. This news generated another round of questions, but Ethan excused himself and made his way to a small cantina across from the courthouse. Inside, he found Morrison and Tommy Chen already working on their second beers. "To justice," Morrison said, raising his glass. They drank to that and to the memory of Peters, who died 3 weeks earlier from an infection that started in his shoulder wound. The young deputy had been buried with full honors, his sacrifice recognized by the entire territory. "What will you do now, Sheriff?" Tommy asked. His own shoulder was healing well, though he'd carry the scar for life. "Keep doing what I've been doing, keeping the peace in Copper Ridge, bringing outlaws to justice." Ethan took a long drink. "Though I might take the governor up on his offer. U.S. Marshal has a nice ring to it." "You'd be good at it," Morrison said. "Better than good. You proved that." They talked for a while longer, 3 men bound together by shared danger and hard-won victory. When they finally parted ways, Ethan felt a sense of completion he hadn't experienced in years. The job was truly finished now. The legal system had done its work. Justice had been served. He rode back to Copper Ridge the next morning, taking his time, enjoying the journey through country that seemed somehow less hostile now. The desert was still brutal and unforgiving, but it no longer felt like enemy territory. It was just land, beautiful in its own harsh way. When he arrived in Copper Ridge, he found his office running smoothly under the care of his deputy, a capable woman named Sarah Reeves, who'd been handling things in his absence. She handed him a stack of correspondence, most of it congratulatory messages from other sheriffs and lawmen across the territory. But one letter stood out. It was from Clara Whitfield, written in elegant script on fine paper. "Dear Sheriff Calder," it read, "I wanted to thank you once more for everything you've done. The trial's conclusion brings me great relief, knowing that those men will answer for their crimes. The school is thriving. I have 17 students now, ranging from age 6 to 14. Every day I teach them reading and arithmetic and history. I think about how close I came to never having this opportunity. You gave me my life back, and I will be forever grateful. Please come visit when your duties allow. There is someone here who asks about you often, though he pretends not to care as much as he does. With deepest respect and friendship, Clara." Ethan smiled at that last part. He had a good idea who Clara was referring to. 2 weeks later, he made the journey to Redemption Springs. The town had grown even in the short time since the celebration. New buildings going up, more families settling in, the signs of prosperity evident everywhere. The mining operations were expanding now that the payroll robbery had been solved and investor confidence restored. Clara's schoolhouse stood on the edge of town, a neat frame building with a bell tower and large windows that let in the afternoon light. Ethan could hear children's voices reciting lessons as he approached. He waited outside until the school day ended, watching as children poured out the door with the boundless energy of youth. Clara appeared last, carrying an armful of books. Her face lit up when she saw him. "Ethan, you came." "Promised I would." He took the books from her arms. "School seems to be going well." "Better than I ever dreamed. These children are so hungry to learn. Some of them walk 5 miles each way just to attend." She locked the schoolhouse door and they began walking toward town. "I heard about the trial, about the sentences. Justice served. Not the way I would have preferred. I'd rather those men had never committed their crimes in the first place. But it's something. It's more than something. It's proof that law can prevail even out here." Claire's voice was firm. "You've shown this territory that there are consequences for evil. That's invaluable." They walked in comfortable silence for a while before Clara spoke again. "Lucas has been helping with the school, built new desks for the children, repaired the roof, even donated books from his own collection. He won't accept payment. Says it's his way of contributing to civilization." "He's settling in all right?" "I think so. Though he still struggles with being around people. Old habits die hard." She glanced at Ethan. "But he's trying. That's what matters." They found Lucas at the general store, negotiating the purchase of lumber for a barn he was building on his new land. He looked different than when Ethan had first met him, still weathered and hard, but somehow more present, more engaged with the world around him. "Ethan," Lucas said, shaking his hand firmly, "didn't expect to see you so soon." "Couldn't stay away. Wanted to see how Redemption Springs was managing. Growing faster than expected, more people arriving every week." Lucas gestured toward the window. See that new hotel going up? And they're talking about bringing the telegraph line through here by next spring. They walked together to Lucas's land, about 2 miles outside town. He'd chosen well: good water, grazing for livestock, timber for building. The foundation for a house had already been laid, and the frame of a barn was taking shape. "You've been busy," Ethan observed. "Keeps my hands occupied. Keeps my mind from dwelling on the past." Lucas picked up a hammer and resumed work on the barn frame. Strange thing, building something instead of destroying it. Takes some getting used to. Ethan helped him work for a while, the physical labor feeling good after weeks of paperwork and testimony. As they worked, they talked about the trial, about the territory's future, about the changes coming to the frontier. "You ever think about settling down?" Lucas asked. "Taking off that star and just living?" "Sometimes. But I'm not sure what I'd do with myself. Being a lawman is who I am." Ethan hammered a nail home. "What about you? Think you'll stay here? Make this work?" Lucas looked toward town where smoke from chimneys rose into the clear sky. "I'm going to try. For the first time in 10 years, I actually want to be part of something, part of a community. Clara says that's progress." "Clara's a smart woman." "That she is." Lucas set down his hammer. "You notice how she talks about the future? Not what might be or could be, but what will be. Like she's already decided how it's going to turn out, and the universe just has to catch up." Ethan laughed. "I did notice that. It's one of the things that kept her alive out there. Pure stubborn determination to survive and build the future she wants." They finished work on the barn frame as the sun began setting. Lucas invited Ethan to stay for dinner, and they rode into town together. Clara had prepared a meal at her small house near the school. Simple fare, but well-cooked and plentiful. As they ate, Clara shared her plans for expanding the school, possibly adding a second room for older students, maybe even hiring an assistant teacher. Lucas talked about his plans for the ranch, about raising horses and maybe cattle if the market looked good. Ethan discussed the governor's offer and his uncertainty about accepting it. "You should take it," Clara said firmly. "U.S. Marshal Calder has a nice ring to it, and you could do tremendous good with that authority." "She's right," Lucas added. "The territory needs men like you in positions of power, men who can't be bought or intimidated." "I'll think about it," Ethan promised. As the evening wore on and the conversation flowed easily, Ethan realized something important. They'd become friends, the three of them. Bound together by shared trauma and triumph, they'd formed a connection that would last. The next morning, Ethan prepared to return to Copper Ridge. Clara and Lucas saw him off at the edge of town. "Don't be a stranger," Clara said, embracing him. "You're always welcome here. I'll visit when I can, and if you need anything, either of you, you send word." Lucas shook his hand. "Safe travels, Ethan, and seriously, take that marshal's job. The frontier needs you." Ethan rode out as the sun climbed higher, looking back once to see Clara and Lucas standing together, waving. There was something right about that image. The schoolteacher and the hermit-turned-rancher, two people who'd been broken by the frontier and were now helping to civilize it. Back in Copper Ridge, life settled into a new rhythm. Ethan accepted the governor's appointment as U.S. Marshal, giving him jurisdiction across the entire territory. His first official act was to organize a coordinated effort among all the local sheriffs to share information about criminal activity and wanted men. Frank Morrison took over as sheriff of Copper Ridge, proving himself just as capable in the role. Tommy Chen became his deputy, the shoulder wound barely slowing him down. The territorial newspapers ran stories about the Riker gang's downfall for months, turning Ethan and Lucas into frontier legends, whether they wanted that status or not. Ethan tried to downplay the attention, but it had consequences. Outlaws thought twice before operating in his jurisdiction, and honest settlers felt safer knowing he was watching over them. 6 months after the trial, Ethan received an invitation to a wedding in Redemption Springs. Lucas Hale and Clara Whitfield were to be married in the spring, in the schoolhouse where their friendship had deepened into something more. Ethan arrived early for the ceremony, wanting to see the town's progress. Redemption Springs had doubled in size. The telegraph had arrived as promised, along with a weekly stagecoach service and a branch office of the territorial bank. The school had indeed expanded, with a second room and an assistant teacher hired from back east. Lucas's ranch was thriving too. He'd built a fine house and was raising horses that were already gaining a reputation for quality. More importantly, he'd become a respected member of the community, serving on the town council, helping settle disputes, using his military experience to train a local militia for protection against the few remaining outlaw gangs. The wedding was simple but beautiful. Clara wore a dress of pale blue, her face radiant with happiness. Lucas stood tall in a new suit, his weathered face softened by genuine joy. When they exchanged vows, promising to build a future together, there wasn't a dry eye in the schoolhouse. Ethan served as Lucas's best man, and in his toast afterward, he spoke of courage and redemption, of how the frontier broke some people but forged others into something stronger than they'd been before. Lucas and Clara represent the best of what this territory can be, he said, raising his glass. They've faced the worst the frontier has to offer and refused to let it define them. Instead, they've chosen to build something good and lasting. That's true courage, that's true strength, and that's the future we're all working toward. The celebration lasted into the night, with music and dancing and the kind of pure joy that comes from witnessing two people who genuinely belong together. Ethan danced with Clara once, and she thanked him again for everything he'd done. "I never could have imagined this," she said, looking at Lucas across the room. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. Now I have everything I ever wanted, a school, a home, a man I love who loves me back. It feels like a miracle." "No miracle," Ethan said. "Just people refusing to give up. You, Lucas, all of us. We fought for this. We earned it." As the celebration wound down, Ethan found himself standing outside with Lucas, looking up at the stars that blazed across the desert sky. "You nervous about married life?" Ethan asked. Lucas smiled. "Terrified. But in a good way. For 10 years I told myself I didn't deserve happiness, didn't deserve a second chance. Clara showed me I was wrong, that there's always hope if you're willing to reach for it. She's good for you. She's the best thing that ever happened to me. And it never would have happened if you hadn't tracked down Riker's gang, if you hadn't saved her." Lucas turned to face him. "I owe you everything, Ethan. My whole future started the day you refused to give up on finding her. You don't owe me anything. You saved her too, remember? Found her when she was dying, brought her back to life. You earned this happiness just as much as she did." They stood in companionable silence for a while, two men who'd walked through fire together and emerged stronger for it. "What about you?" Lucas asked. "Ever think about settling down, finding someone?" Ethan shrugged. "Maybe someday. Right now the job keeps me busy. There's still a lot of work to do out here. Outlaws to catch, order to maintain, justice to serve. The territory's lucky to have you. We'll see if you still think that when I come investigating some crime in your neighborhood." Lucas laughed. "Fair enough, Marshal, fair enough." The next morning, Ethan prepared to leave. Claire and Lucas saw him off once more, but this time they stood as husband and wife, their hands intertwined, their future stretching bright before them. "Take care of each other," Ethan said. "We will," Clara promised. "And you take care of yourself, Ethan Calder. The frontier needs you whole and healthy." Ethan rode out, looking back one last time at the couple standing in front of their home. Behind them, the school rose against the sky. Children already gathering for the day's lessons. Smoke curled from chimneys throughout town. The sound of hammers and saws echoed as new buildings went up. This was the frontier he'd fought for. Not a lawless wasteland ruled by violence, but a place where families could build futures, where children could get education, where justice prevailed over chaos. The months turned into years. Jack Morley was hanged as scheduled, going to his death with the same cold smile he'd worn in life. Kyle Henderson served his sentence and was released, immediately leaving the territory and never returning. The Apache tribes, once threatened with war over a lie, maintained peace with the settlers, and trade between the two groups flourished. Ethan's reputation as a marshal grew. He tracked down and brought to justice dozens of criminals, always working within the law, always giving men the chance to surrender before resorting to violence. Some territories tried to recruit him away with higher salaries and better positions, but he stayed loyal to the land that had forged him. Lucas and Clara's ranch became one of the most successful in the territory. They raised horses and children, 3 in all, 2 boys and a girl. Lucas taught them to ride and rope and respect the land. Clara taught them to read and write and think critically. Together they raised a family that embodied the best values of the frontier. The school in Redemption Springs expanded again and again, eventually becoming an academy that drew students from across the territory. Clara served as headmistress for 20 years before retiring, but her influence shaped generations of young people who went on to become teachers, lawyers, doctors, and leaders throughout the West. 5 years after the wedding, Ethan finally did settle down. He met a widow named Elizabeth Grant who ran a boarding house in Silver Creek. She was practical and strong and completely unimpressed by his reputation, which he found refreshing. They married quietly and built a life together, Elizabeth managing the home while Ethan continued his work as marshal. 10 years after the Riker gang was destroyed, the three of them, Ethan, Lucas, and Clara, gathered in Redemption Springs for the dedication of a monument in the town square. It honored all those who died in the stagecoach ambush, ensuring their names would never be forgotten. Marshal Tom Bridger, Pike Wilson, Danny Reeves, young Peters, who died of his wounds weeks after the final battle. The monument was simple but dignified, carved from local stone. The inscription read, "In memory of those who gave their lives in service to law and order. Their sacrifice helped build a better frontier." As they stood before the monument, Clara spoke quietly. "It seems like a lifetime ago." "It was a lifetime ago," Lucas said, his arm around her shoulders. "We're different people now than we were then." Ethan nodded. "Better people, I think. Stronger. We took something terrible and built something good from it." Clara looked at him with those intelligent brown eyes that had witnessed so much. "Do you think it's really over? The violence, the chaos, the constant threat?" "No," Ethan admitted. "There will always be men who choose evil over good, who take rather than build. But there will also always be people willing to stand against them. That's what matters. Not that evil exists, but that good people refuse to surrender to it." Lucas's oldest son, a boy of 8 named Thomas, came running up. "Father, can we go to the school now? Mother promised to show us where she taught when she first came here." Clara laughed and took the boy's hand. "Yes, let's go. You should all see where this story really began." They walked together to the old schoolhouse, which had been preserved as a historical site even as newer, larger buildings took over the educational duties. Inside, everything was just as Clara had left it that terrible day. The desk where she'd planned lessons, the books she'd brought from Philadelphia, the small globe that had traveled thousands of miles to teach frontier children about the wider world. "This is where I was heading when Riker's gang attacked the stage," Clara explained to the children gathered around her. "I was so excited, so full of dreams about teaching and making a difference. I never imagined how hard it would be, how much I'd have to endure." "But you survived," young Thomas said proudly. "More than survived. I thrived. And you know why?" She looked at each child in turn. "Because I refused to let evil men steal my future. Because I believed that what I was doing mattered. And because good people, your father, Marshal Calder, and so many others, refused to give up on bringing those men to justice." Ethan watched as Clara continued the lesson, turning history into something immediate and vital. This was her gift, taking the harsh realities of frontier life and transforming them into teachable moments, into inspiration for the next generation. Later that evening, as the three of them sat on Lucas and Clara's porch watching the sunset, they reflected on everything that had changed. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Lucas said. "What if I'd taken a different route that day? What if I'd been a few hours later getting to Blackstone Canyon? Clara might have died out there, and I'd still be living alone in my cabin, hiding from the world." "But you didn't take a different route," Clara said firmly. "You found me exactly when I needed to be found. Everything happened exactly as it was meant to." Ethan raised his glass. "To chance meetings and second chances. To justice served and evil defeated. To the frontier that tested us and the friends who stood beside us. To the future," Clara added, "to all the good that's still to come." They drank to that as the sun disappeared below the horizon, painting the desert sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple and red. The same desert that had nearly killed Clara, that had hidden murderers and tested lawmen, now cradled a growing civilization. The frontier was still hard, still unforgiving in many ways, but it was also filled with people like Clara and Lucas and Ethan, People who refused to let the harshness define them, who chose to build rather than destroy, who stood for law and order even when it would have been easier to look away. 20 years after the ambush, Marshal Ethan Calder finally retired, his hair gray and his face lined, but his spirit as strong as ever. The territory he'd helped civilize honored him with a ceremony attended by lawmen from a dozen jurisdictions. In his retirement speech, he spoke of the importance of never giving up, of always standing for justice, of building a society where law prevailed over chaos. Lucas and Clara attended the ceremony, their own children grown and starting families of their own. They'd become pillars of their community, respected, loved, and proof that even people scarred by violence could build beautiful lives. That evening, the three old friends sat together one more time, sharing memories and laughter. They spoke of the hunt across the desert, of the confrontation at Salt Creek, of the final battle at the Broken Hills. They remembered the fear and exhaustion and desperate determination that had driven them forward, but mostly they spoke of gratitude. Gratitude for survival, for friendship, for the privilege of having made a difference in a wild and dangerous time. As the night deepened and stars emerged overhead, Clara said softly, "Do you think people will remember? 100 years from now, will anyone know what we did?" Ethan considered the question. "Maybe not our names, but they'll live in the civilization we helped build. Every child who goes to school safely, every family that settles without fear of lawless violence, every person who trusts that justice will be served. They'll all be living proof that what we did mattered." Lucas nodded. "We changed the ending. That's what matters. The frontier could have gone a different way, could have stayed savage and lawless. But people like us, we pushed it toward civilization, toward order, toward hope." "And that's enough," Clara said, peace evident in her voice. "More than enough." They sat in comfortable silence as the night settled around them. Three people who'd been tested by the frontier's harshest trials and emerged victorious. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and brutal as always. But now it held towns and schools and ranches. It held families and futures and dreams being built into reality. The wilderness was still there, would always be there, but civilization had claimed its foothold and would not be driven back. In the years that followed, all three of them passed peacefully, surrounded by family and friends, their lives complete. Their names were carved on monuments and remembered in stories. Children learned about the Riker gang's defeat, about the school teacher who survived, the hermit who found redemption, and the lawman who refused to quit. But more importantly, they lived on in the society they'd helped create, a frontier transformed from lawless wasteland into thriving civilization, where justice prevailed and good people could build futures without fear. The desert sun rose each morning on towns and schools and ranches, on children playing safely and families working honestly, on a land that remembered its savage past but had chosen a better future. And sometimes, when the wind blew across the endless plains and through the canyon lands, it carried echoes of an older time, of courage tested and evil defeated, of three souls who'd stood together when it mattered most. The frontier had demanded everything from them, and they had given it freely, knowing that some things were worth any price: justice, honor, civilization, hope. These were the gifts they'd left behind, not perfect, never perfect, but real and lasting and true. And in the end, that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. It was